here in the Director of Program and Public Policy and on the advisory board for the center. And I had to miss the sessions yesterday and this morning, but I'm delighted to be here today. And we have two really interesting presentations, at least from the topics and the abstracts. So Melinda Gormley from Notre Dame will be starting us out, and I'll leave it to her.
All right. So
And I'll give you a sign at 2 minutes before
okay.
20 minutes.
So the topic is science policy, or the title, science policy and the activist scientist. So to give you some background of where I'm coming to this topic, I'm a historian of science, and I've done 2 biographical studies, one on Linus Pauling, who's probably the better or the known of the 2, chemist who was born in 1901, died in 1994, and did a lot of work in structural chemistry, was in a race for DNA to figure out the structure of DNA with Watson and Crick, is even more well known to people today if they do remember him for his work on vitamin C and pushing orthomolecular medicine in trying to cure the common cold and cancer and all kinds of flu, the sort of 3 main things that he would talk about. And what I actually focused on when I was looking at him was his work on sickle cell anemia and hemoglobin, and how this was work that went throughout his life. From the time he switched from inorganic chemistry to organic chemistry in 1932, he picked up hemoglobin almost just right away. And then it just kept going throughout his life, even into orthomolecular medicine, but I was most interested in his work in molecular biology and molecular medicine. That was a lot of work that he did in the 40s and 50s. Statements he made in the 60s then as well, in that Pauling would talk about mutagenic effects caused by nuclear weapons. And he would talk about how there's one mutation in one strand of hemoglobin that can cause you to have sickle cell anemia. So, and then how he would use sickle cell anemia as a way to talk about the effects that might be possible from mutations because of radioactivity, radioactive fallout. The other person is L.C. Dunn. L.C. stands for Leslie Clarence Dunn. He is a geneticist who worked at Columbia University. Born in 1893, died in 1974. He was a geneticist who mainly did mammalian genetics. So he started on mice at Harvard Bucy Institute, working with William Castle, then went to the Storrs in Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station to work on fowl for the most part, and then got this when T.H. Morgan left for Caltech. He was replaced. L.C. Dunn filled that spot in the Department of Zoology, and then worked in the Department of Zoology at Columbia University from 1928 till 1962. Dunn was pretty much working on mice at that point in time. And then his main sort of pieces of work have to do with, well, I guess I can sort of do this before I get too much into that. So that's the background of the kinds of studies I've done for my master's thesis and my PhD dissertation. And what I've been trying to do lately then is respond to another body of literature that's out there in history of science, which is things like Steve Shapin saying that we're hyper-professional. All we do is talk within our sections of people, and we talk to 3 people, and those 3 people are the only ones who really read what we write. And how can we do something that engages a larger audience? How can we engage not just other historians of science, but science studies scholars in general? How can we engage with the general public? And that came out in ISIS 2006, but it also echoes something that John Halbrin said back in 1986 that was then published in 87 about doing an applied history of science. And he said that applied history of science is general, like what can we as historians of science do to improve general education, science education, and science policy? And again, you hear echoes of that. Well, this is actually resurfaced yet again now that Lynn Neihart's the president of the History of Science Society. She has made a call for what she calls History of Science Unbound, that we should be writing for a greater population. And one of the things, of course, she mentions is we could be writing about science policy and doing something that, that but that's not the only thing that we can do. We can write for a general audience and teach people about, science. And so there's been this call that's, lots of different time periods that's just been made. And so I've been really thinking about this a lot, especially just reading some of the different books that come out, like Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway make a call in their book, Merchants of Doubt, that, we as science studies scholars, there's something we can do to help people understand the process of science and what, what does uncertainty mean to a scientist, and how do these different, how do different entities come into play in policy. So I've been grappling with all this and trying to figure out, what can I do with my biographical research that I can say something about science policy. Because I've worked and looked at these two people who are just doing tons of policy work. But yet I never thought of it as science policy. I thought of it as like, they're political activists. They're really engaged, citizen scientists. They're activist scientists. And so, and this is one of my frustrations, that there's all this literature that science studies scholars do in science policy, yet a lot of us historians of science are not speaking with them, are not reading it, don't know about it. So what I really then have been mapping out and trying to do is figure, how can I turn one or both of these biographical works into something that would be read by a general audience, that might be read by scientists and be educational for them, using history to help people deal with what science policy is like today, or how that person as a scientist is an activist scientist and the kinds of things that they face. So how can I look at these people's lives and help to explain some of that? So what I've come to is just some different things that I find that we don't differentiate. And I think that if we were to sort of start teasing apart some of these aspects about science policy and activist scientists, we would actually get, it would help people to understand where they're at and what they're doing. So one of the things is, for example, something that's in a lot of science studies literature on science policy is differentiating between science in policy and policy for science. That science in policy being, how science, and this actually goes back to Harvey Brooks, wrote an article in 1964, and I'll actually read what he says about scientific advisors. He says, in a somewhat oversimplified way, the functions of the scientific advisor can be divided into those concerns with science in policy and those concerned with policy for science. The first is concerned with matters that are basically political or administrative, but are significantly dependent upon technical factors, such as the nuclear test ban, disarmament policy, the use of science in international relations. And then the second is concerned, and so this is policy for science, is concerned with the development of policies for the management and support of the national scientific enterprise, and with the selection and evaluation of substantive scientific programs. So policy for science is, the infrastructure, the money that pays for science. And what you see Harvey Brooks says, you have these two different kinds of science policy, but they're really intertwined. Sheila Jasanoff then echoes that, right? That these are very intertwined. They're helpful to define, as different definitions, but we really need to look at them both. And then you see this Roger Pilkey as well with Michelle Betzel have an article where they too are like, they say, these two are so connected, yet it is important to differentiate them. And so and so in learning more and more about what people are saying about science policy, I look at both Dunn and Pauling, and they did both. They both were trying, and Pauling worked with, he was on one of the 4 committees that Vannevar Bush put together in order to write Science, the Endless Frontier. He was on the Medical Advisory Committee, or the Palmer Committee. Whereas Dunn went to Senator Kilgore and said, here's some of the things that need to happen. And from 1943 to 46, he was writing legislation and he was working with Kilgore. And then Barry Commoner came to Dunn and said, we need someone who's going to be the face of biology in front of at the congressional hearings. We want you to be that person. And part of this is because biology was being considered as medicine. And it was pretty much, we'll put money into medicine, we'll put money into agriculture, there is no other bio. And so the biology people were like, that's not good, right? We want biology to have a space. And they wanted Dunn to represent that face. So So that's, that's what they're doing in terms of policy for science, but there's also the science in policy that each is doing, Pauling won 2 Nobel Prizes. One is a Nobel Peace Prize, and it's for disarmament. And he's petitions that he helped to put through, one working actually with Barry Commoner and A.U. Condon, leads to limited test ban treaty. So there's various things that he's doing in terms of making speeches and pushing for certain kinds of policies in terms of nuclear weapons and disarmament. And then Dunn was on advisory committees. The Carnegie Institute of Washington put together 2 advisory committees to look at the Eugenics Records Office and whether or not what was coming out of it was valuable. And so in 1929, they didn't really say much because both Charles Davenport and Henry Laughlin were actually on the Harry Laughlin were actually on the committee. So I mean, you can't really say much when the 2 people who are the head and the superintendent of the Eugenics Records Office is right there. So they had these very tentative, didn't say much. But in 1935, the committee Dunn, is making some very specific statements about how, and this is sort of his constant statement was that eugenics is 2 things. Eugenics is human genetics, and then it's the application of of what we know about genetics to make some sort of laws about how who can procreate or who shouldn't be procreating. And so his statement was that there has to be a really strong human genetics component at the Eugenics Record Office, and there's not. But he also would make these statements and getting more and more cautious and saying, I really think we should do eugenics when eugenics is human genetics, the research of genetics in human beings. But I don't like where things are going with the application of what we know about genetics and genetic principles. But what we remember as the definition of eugenics is the latter, that application. But for a long time, it was a definite dual definition. But this leads him then into working with UNESCO. He wrote a book with Theodosius Dobzhansky called Heredity, Race, and Society. And then because of that book, UNESCO comes to him and says, we are going to do some pamphlets on race. We want you to write one. So he writes one on race and biology. Very sort of very looking for a very educated group of people to speak with. I mean, it's at sort of the high education level, very technical, but very educational. And he has some statements in there about, his view is that, and what Dunn and Dobzhansky say in Heredity, Race, and Society as well, is that there's a beauty to all the diversity within like a beauty to human diversity. We need all types, right? We want to have plumbers and artists and poets. We want all these different things, and we should embrace the diversity of races and the different kinds of people that there are. And sort of more privately, Dunn always said, we as scientists can only say so much before we stop acting as scientists and we start taking on a totally different role. And we need to differentiate what those roles are. That I'm no longer being a scientist, I am now advocating, or I am now giving you my opinion. But the UNESCO pamphlets wanted something different. They wanted you to take the science and then make some sort of ethical statement about how people should behave. So anyways, he writes the race and biology, but he also uses it to make a pictorial pamphlet, mainly using pictures to convey some of the basic educational pieces called What is Race? And so again, a different audience. I mean, it's taking the race and biology and trying to repackage it in a way that's for a different audience, and this is for international audiences. So this was sort of his way of doing science in policy, and he's very much reacting to what happened in terms of Germany and laws that came, German laws that started in 1933. And for Dunn, he actually did work on refugee committees, the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced Foreign Scholars. He was on it for its entirety from 1933 to 1945, helping refugees, meeting them actually going to boats in New York to meet people when they came off, and then giving them a place at Columbia University or somewhere in New York until they could get them somewhere else. So I mean, all kinds of different activism that he's doing. So, I mean, I see that I have all of this, but then I start questioning, well, how else can I go and I can differentiate all of what's, when I look at these activist scientists, there's more than just, okay, they're doing policy for science and policy. And so I've been trying to figure out other things that help me to look at. And one of the things I did talk a lot about in the case of Dunn when looking at him is that a lot of his work's behind the scenes and another bit of his work is very public. And trying to figure out, I mean, I don't know that I like calling it internal and external, but he does like when I think of he's doing a behind the scenes, it's more of what he's doing with Kilgore when he's talking to policymakers, what it is that he does as on an advisory committee for the Carnegie Institute of Washington, right? It's stuff it's committee work and it's advising, but it's not for the public really to see and to read. But then he has all these pamphlets for UNESCO, and he has his book, and these are venues where he can talk about race and publish and hit lots of different audiences by catering the different publications to different audiences. So that's something that I think, though, you can also then sort of attach that up to, that you can have an internal science and policy or an external science and policy, or like a public, I guess, or I'm not sure which words I like best, but like doing policy for science publicly would be going to the people and saying, we need more funding for AIDS research. This is not an example for either of them, but we need more money for X, and then getting the public to help push for passing policies that help put money and funding into research. So I think you can do the same thing with internal, external in terms of policy for science as well, and try to get a better handle on what exactly the person's doing and how they're going about doing that. So then another thing that I also I've turned to, like Pilkey's 4 roles for activists, so that if you are a science advisor, there are 4 roles you can take on. One is a pure scientist. You don't, there is no, I don't have any opinions, or I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to give you lots and lots of information. Science arbiter, it's more tailored information, but it's still not really any kind of advising or advocacy. Honest broker, which is what the book that this comes from is called The Honest Broker. I mean, here are lots of different choices so you as the policymaker and group can make a choice. And then the issue advocate, and then he also talks about a stealth issue advocate, but that issue advocate being, this is my point, right? This is what I think you should do, which is very much appalling, standing up in the later years and talking about disarmament. This is what I think we need to do to have world peace. And then laying out his different ideas. And then the other point that Pilkey makes is a stealth issue advocate, where people are not openly saying this is what I think we should do, but doing it in a very stealthy manner under the radar. Which I don't know that I like those so much, because what I usually think of, I actually usually think in terms of a spectrum from educator to advisor to advocate, where for Dunn and for Pauling, like for Dunn, a lot of his books are very much written in as an educator. He's trying to educate people about genetics, what is known about the principles of genetics, but he also has some advice in there. In the Heredity, Race, and Society, most of the advice is at the end of chapters, at the very end of the book. It's not threaded throughout, but there's advice in there about what they value and what they think is important, Dunn and Dobzhansky. And then, advocacy, where, and one of my newer projects has to do with looking at sort of a set of books. But what you see over time is that when you go from like the 40s, 50s, by the time you get to the 60s, there are these books where it's like there are appendices that tell you what you can do about, here's a letter to write to your congressperson, you just fill in the blanks. Here's a letter, or here's, and then these books are telling you this is what you can do. And the Dunn stuff is on the early end, so I see it much more as education and some advising, but not as strongly advocating. But then that also gets me to one other thing that I'm wrestling with, and I'm not exactly sure what to do with. Oh, okay, so good, because I won't talk about that.
To wrap it up.
So to wrap it up, so part of, I'm thinking why should I, why differentiate all this? Why go through this whole process of trying to figure out, different categories. But I think part of it is, if it's a way to get at, trying to deal with the politicization of science, and really trying to piece apart that, and try to make sense of what's going on. I think there's a way to make sense of what's going on today, because I've actually seen, scientists talk, plenary talks, and you can see they're grappling with the roles that they take on as advisors, but they don't have any way to identify what they're doing or really and make sense of it. And so I feel like a lot of stuff that's muddled together could get pieced apart, and it might help to make more sense. And I'm hoping I can do it in a way that actually somebody who would be caught up in the narrative of someone's life, Dunn's life, and what he did, would actually take something away about how, the science policy process works.
Great, thank you. Scott Tanona, or some name that's
No, that's
like
exactly
that,
it.
from University of Kansas.
Great, thanks. So, I am talking about today framing and the issue of advocacy, ethical issues of whether scientists should or shouldn't frame, and frame their communications with the public, and whether it's appropriate to do so. Okay, so I am. This is work that's done in coordination with Bruce Gleamore and Amy Laura. Amy was very involved in. There's two parts of what I'm going to be talking about. Amy was very involved in the empirical part. Some of what I say later on may stray a little bit from more than what we've done together. Bruce has been involved in all this all along. This is also work that's done with people from departments of psychology and others, and I'll give you some more information about that later. All right, so basically the idea here about framing, I'm not going to try to define framing. You may have heard this or seen about this, read about this before, but this was Nisbet and Mooney in 2007 in Science basically had this piece where they basically told scientists that they need to be communicating better with the public. Scientists are guilty of just doing data dumps. They just give these facts. They don't tell people enough what it means, how they should use it in their lives, things like that. He said, and what they say is that scientists need to pay attention to how they frame their communication. They should deliberately talk about things in the context in terms of what it means to people and why they should care about it. Okay. While we hear a lot about scientists, activists, and advocates in a whole bunch of different areas, in general, scientists tend to resist, I think, and be very careful about issues of advocacy. The reaction from the scientific community was decidedly negative. No, we're not going to engage in spin. That's not our job. Truth, facts, stick to the facts. We don't do that kind of stuff. That doesn't make us any different than anybody else. Okay, so this raises for us two separate questions. The first question is a psychological, sociological one. So what would actually move scientists to be willing to frame? Because that piece didn't. Well, maybe did some, but overall, right? Didn't have the reaction I think they expected. But then there's an ethical question: ought we actually be doing what they say? All right. So we're going to engage in both of those. I'm going to go over stuff we did to answer the first part, or to try to start getting at an answer to the first part. I'm going to go really quickly through that though, to get into the second part. Okay. So the quick part is the following. Let's suppose, so if you want to ask the question, what might move people to engage in certain kind of framing of their communication with the public, we thought of several different areas that might matter. Here's a list of them, but one of them is the effectiveness, and that's mostly what Nisbet and Mooney were talking about. Look, you're not effective enough. People aren't understanding you. They're not caring. To be more effective, to have the impact, right? You got to be doing things differently. Okay. People just won't understand it unless you talk about it. And so it's effectiveness they're mostly paying attention to. But there's some of the reactions, that's not right, stick to the facts, things like that, sound more moral or ethical themselves. And so, so we had this question, well, could we see what seems to be mattering here and how we might move people? What might we appeal to, or what might we actually change if we wanted to get them to frame more? All right, and there's, other factors that might matter, we thought. All right, so we engaged in a study to do this, survey, online survey. I won't go through the details here, all right? I also won't go through the details of the analysis, except to basically say the following. What we did in the analysis is we got this survey of questions that were meant to be in these different target areas. Engaged in, on the results, factor analysis of it. We weren't looking at particular correlations between particular questions, all right, but looked to see factors, to see sort of what kinds of factors are behind there. We're not taking any single question as a measure of anything, because there's so many things going on there. So we do some factor analysis, and then do tetrad discovery procedures for causal structures, and I can tell you more about that kind of stuff anytime if you want. And here's basically what we found. This is a drawing of basically the one of several classes, or one of several in a class, the best fit model from the tetrad discovery procedures, also testing beta chi-squared, of the different factors that matter. Here, these factors right here are factors that are underneath, so to speak, if you want to talk about the factors that way. The questions that were directly about, would you do this? So, suppose in the questions we asked in this area were hypothetical tests, thought experiments. Suppose Sue's in this situation. She's trying to convince the public of, this, that, or the other thing. She's really worried that sort of if she gives a number, figure to this number, it's going to be misunderstood. So she's going to use analogies for it instead and not actually give the actual data, the actual figures, right? Is that appropriate or not? Those kinds of questions, or these behavior questions. And then the other questions were about questions about, do you think framing in a particular way or simplifying is effective in these kinds of contexts? What are your obligations to communicate your information if you've got public funding or if you don't? And these are what we call the CN, or the communication norms. These are sort of low level. I think questions like should scientists be advocating at all, kinds of things like that. Okay, and what we found mattered. We found relations between factors behind the causal norm kind of questions. The communicative norm questions, all right, about odds kind of things, all right, but nothing directly about effectiveness. So, to the extent that that we want to take this result and use with it, at least it's suggestive of the following thing. Maybe you shouldn't just go around and tell scientists you're going to communicate more effectively, because that's not directly tied to sort of what they say about doing something. But you gotta talk morality, you gotta talk ethics, all right? Because that seems to matter for them, what their obligations are. If you're not doing that, maybe you're not going to sort of have enough impact on these things, all right? Is roughly that's what this is suggestive of it, all right? And I think that seems reasonable, even just given sort of how if you do a little bit of analysis of what they say. So here's a question. So if this is a moral issue for them, what moral things matter? So we did some more study of that kind of stuff, context analysis of some interviews and some other things like that. All right, and you get things like the following: truth-telling is important. It is, but it seems to be important for them, sort of, among a lot of things, right? We should be unbiased information providers, etc. But now here's the kicker: is I don't think scientists see truth-telling as being an overriding norm. Okay? Because in the other circumstances, in our survey, in the survey, actually, in the content analysis and other things you see, scientists are willing to be a little looser with the facts. I mean, loose in the sense of like complete, full, factual, just the details, every little number, et cetera, I got to give the data, right? No, they're not. They're happy to simplify and omit evidential details in all kinds of other circumstances, at least when they're trying to get people to understand things or get general concepts, et cetera, all right? So what's the difference? I think we see a difference between there's a willingness to engage in these kinds of activities when the aim is to get people to understand a concept. I'll leave out some of the details just so they get an understanding, but once you're actually advocating or communicating to gain acceptance, and some of our questions in the survey did relate to, suppose she's doing this just to get people to understand something. Suppose she's doing this because she wants them to accept a particular policy. All right. When you're in the policy acceptance, accept the data, accept the evidence, believe it, rather than just understand what the scientist is trying to say. This seems to be when scientists are more reluctant, to do something beyond telling the complete and total facts, all right, or less than telling the complete and total facts. All right, so this is more hypothesis here for what's going on. I could tell you more about why I think maybe this is what's going on, or why we think this is what's going on. But one thing that would explain this anyway is that there's a concern for audience autonomy. Okay, when you're just trying to get people to understand a concept, this is understanding a concept. It's not obviously sort of a matter of choice here. You just sort of, this is what I'm trying to explain to you. Just understand this. But when you're talking about advocating or look, you should accept this finding and do something with it, right? Then a respect for autonomy might lead one to sort of be more careful in telling you what you actually ought to believe, or just believe this or do this, or get something to get you to have that belief by sort of marketing or spinny or things like that. But rather just, no, I'll just give you the information and you decide what you want to do with it. All right, sounds like the kind of thing that's a respect for autonomy. Okay, all right, so that's our account of what we think may kind of going on in the scientists' resistance to engage in either certain kinds of advocacy and in particular the idea that you shouldn't just explain what your scientific results are, but you should always be telling people why it matters. Okay, spin kind of stuff. All right, framing. So the ethical question: under what conditions is it okay to frame? In particular, if you want to respect audience or public autonomy or individual's autonomy, does that mean you should not frame? Okay. So let's start talking in a little more detail. I call these things working assumptions here, mostly because I'm not going to go through and sort of try to give you all the reasons why I think why we're thinking this is the right way to think about stuff. Okay, and if nothing else, you just kind of understand the framework we're coming from. All right, so frames, well, lots of stuff you could say about frames, but the most important thing for us is that different frames are going to elicit different sets of values. Right, the most famous framing things. The Tversky Kahneman stuff from the 1970s. You provide the same exact same exact scenario, same facts, but you just describe it in terms of saving lives or preventing deaths, and it elicits different kind of policy, acceptance of different kinds of policies, right? Even though it's the same facts. All right. So why? Well, basically you're eliciting different sets of values. Do you care more about although it's kind of funny to see how it actually works with the same facts because of the same facts, but basically it's sort of, you're getting more risk avoidance, right? In one situation, you're more willing to accept risks in the other, okay? All right, so what's autonomy? All right, well, freedom to choose one's goals and work towards them. If there were ethicists, if there were ethicists here, we'd have to sort of have more talk about this, but this is good enough for us right now. All right, but here's a key point to point out. Reasoning well matters. Why does reasoning well matters? Autonomy is not just about choosing what you want to do. It's about choosing what you want to do and actually being able to do something about it, right? Actually being able to get there. So, for example, paternalism tends to be seen to be justified when somebody's just incapacitated in their ability to sort of reason. Well, they have these goals and then they're not working towards them, all right? So autonomy, respecting autonomy means respecting your choice of your goals, but reasoning well matters, okay? So it means respecting reasoning well towards those goals too. Okay, so what is reasoning well? For us, rationality is not some sort of independent ideal. As far as I know, the best theory of rationality is a means-end rationality, all right, decision theoretic kind of stuff, right? You tell me what your goals are, right, and then we give the machinery and so we figure out the best way to achieve them. That's the rational way to achieve your goals. That's what I'm thinking about in terms of rationality. Are you behaving rationally if you're doing things that will in fact conduce to your goals? Okay. So, point. All theories of rationality of this sort, decision theoretic kinds of theories of rationality, take values as inputs, right? You have to know the goals first. You have to know also values about, say, risk avoidance and things like that. What rule to choose, or you want to, so we could talk about that later if you wanted. All right, so, but you have to put those in. No theory of rationality can tell you what your fundamental preferences ought to be. It can tell you to value something instrumentally. If you want to go here, right, if you want to get into law school, then you should value, you should want to graduate college with a high GPA. If you want to graduate from college from IPA, then you should have as an intermediate goal pass my class in logic, right? Things like that, right? I'll do well in my class in logic, actually, right? So it can give you the instrumental values, but it can't sort of, well, where do you get the fundamental? Well, it only gives you an instrumental by putting something in, so it has to end somewhere, all right? So it can't tell you what the fundamental preferences ought to be. Okay. All right. More about where we're coming from. Science is value laden. Most of us here are pretty happy saying that, but one important, the value I'm going to be talking about right here is the value that's maybe not emphasized when people say value laden. When people say value laden in terms of science, they're often thinking about sort of the other so-called external, right, or initially thought of maybe as external values, all right? Truth is a value, all right? If you care about truth or not, or approximate truth, or whatever you want to write, but sort of, we won't get into sort of too much what science is really about, but, hey, truth, actually, there's truth in there, okay? Predictability, if you want to just talk about it, there's truth about something, and predictability, all right? So, do you care about these things? Well, yeah, there are all kinds of conditions under which we're going to instrumentally care about them, but we care about them, right? And we have to recognize that as people talking about science and values, that in fact truth is a value, okay? Or caring about truth is a value, I guess, all right? Now, this is just a fact, I think, about people. There's not a lot, I think, to say. I don't think there's a lot of sort of, not a lot of studies on this, probably because it's really hard to sort of figure out what people are really valuing. You can study behaviors, you can do all kinds of other stuff. I think if you look at behaviors, it becomes pretty clear that in plenty of circumstances, some things other than truth are preserved or preferred over truth. Sometimes people care more about that. And I can give you an example. This is Bruce's favorite example. He's got a kid who wants to be a world-class soccer player. That's it. That is his main goal in life. It's easier for Bruce to say this, I guess. I haven't ever said this in public, but his kid just doesn't have the, not a lot of people are going to have the genetic makeup and sort of everything else to sort of be there. It's sort of, whatever, and, the way Bruce says it is like, ain't gonna happen, kid, right? But he's a good soccer player, but we're talking world class, right? This is sort of, if you're not art, right? So you're not, doesn't seem like you got it, but here's another fact about becoming a world-class soccer player. If you want to become a world-class soccer player, a necessary condition for that has got to be sort of practicing like crazy from way early, right? All right, so that's your main goal. It's the most important goal in life. You've got to be practicing like crazy from way early, right? Sort of what conditions are you going to practice from goals, practicing like crazy from way early? Not if your dad is telling you you don't got a kid, at least not if you believe him. So what's Johannes got to believe? He's got to believe he's got it in him. He's got to ignore any evidence he's got to the contrary, right? Suppose it's absolutely true. He doesn't, the genetics, the disposition is just not there. He's rational, we say, in rejecting that information, in rejecting the evidence to the contrary, right? Because that's the action that's going to best conduce to him achieving his goals. Okay? And I don't think there's much else you can say about that. If that's true, right, in that situation where that is really, you care about that more than truth, okay? All right, so I have just a few minutes for the implications, which is all right, because I'm just going to go quickly through this, all right? More time needed to be spent on kind of the framework where we're coming from. The rest of this kind of falls out. First implication, scientific conclusions are warranted given goals of, for example, knowing the truth about the natural world or making good predictions about the natural world. That's sort of what the business of science is about, okay? You should believe them if that's what you care about, right? For a good scientific result with good evidence, et cetera, right? Now also a fact is that often, in fact very often, acceptance of scientific results is required to reason well, right? And I think this explains why people so much think truth or science may be, truth anyway is neutral, right? Science is value neutral. Why? Because it's sort of, it's the stuff that's sort of just, it's the stuff that lets you get to the stuff you want to get to, right? It's sort of, it's not something you want to get to per se. It's it's that neutral thing that helps you get there. Okay, but it doesn't always get you there, right? If you don't care about the truth, and if caring, your ultimate goal doesn't depend on the truth or making good predictions or whatever, then science won't have that instrumental value. So, expertise is in the title of the paper. What do scientists have expertise about? They have expertise about, this stuff. Given particular goals, what should you believe? That is their expert area, I would say. Okay. They are not experts in what goals you should have in the first place. Because scientists are not experts about what goals you should have in the first place, they are right to be. Okay, so they are right. So right here. So just not experts in goals you should get to in the first place. So let me just give you the information and use it if you want to, right? So they're right to resist spinning stuff in marketing and kind of makes you want something, right? They're right to resist that because that's not their area of expertise, okay? But no, in fact, it doesn't just mean dump the data or give the results without sort of telling you how you should think about them. All right, this, and I won't go through this, but look, this is a leftover from Kant, who said rationality was this sort of pure, independent thing. The truth was sort of just out there, and this was, but that's not the way it works. Knowing the truth is not always conducive to you getting what you want. All right, and there's lots of ways we can see this. Just people misinterpret small numbers, they misinterpret big numbers. Cases of cognitive bias are a lot more complicated because sometimes, in fact, it's rational, I think, to act like you have this bias if you don't want the truth. But but there are lots of ways in which just the data or just the results or just things like this are not going to actually help you get what you want. You're going to misuse them. Okay. So this is all the punchline. The punchline is basically a bunch of things here. Scientists won't be persuaded to frame their communications with the public just by being told it's effective. They're right not to be so persuaded. It's a moral issue. All right, respecting public autonomy is a legitimate ethical concern, I think. All right, but respecting public autonomy does not mean just giving people information. It means giving people information in ways they can use it. All right, and often then it means, and this is a little more complicated, but sometimes you don't just say it in terms of the way the things you think they have right now, but sometimes you gotta, tell them ways it's useful, and then they'll be able to use it. All right, thanks. Funding, and there's other people who help us.
Kansas State. Well, I think with a small group, we can just open it up for discussion. I'm going to have to leave in 10 minutes, but we can continue as long as you like, until the bus takes you back to Mountain. Who wants to start us out? Yes.
Scott, real quick, could you bring back up not the funding slide, but the last substantive slide?
Sure. Oh, because it's not viewing. That's why. I know. And because, alright, so really what I just... I hate it when people, I'm much better at this in general. I know how to...
Just click on number 14.
Yeah, but then I'd have to use the mouse. That's why, so I didn't have it up here. Now that's coming back up. There it is.
So the answer is actually no.
Next question.
Yes. All right. So what do you want to ask about it? Well,
So at the very end, you said something like respecting public autonomy requires, and I didn't quite catch what came after requires. It was maybe presenting information in a way that the public can use?
yeah.
Okay.
And it gives the connection between maybe not just the way the public can use. So it gives connections between the results and applications, basically, right? So this is why it's going to be helpful. This is right. So that's the framing part, right? That's the let's talk about this scientific result in terms of social justice, or in terms of better crops, or in terms of whatever, right? And tell people how it's connected. If they don't care about better crops, okay, then I don't need to know that. But then all of a sudden you got, okay, if you care about better crops, I think that's an area of scientific expertise. I think it's perfectly fine to say, you know, how that's connected, right? Yeah. In a way, maybe it should seem uncontroversial, I don't know, but in fact, the sort of that next step, like, and this will help you get better crops, or and this is a social justice issue is one that's resisted of.
So I'm curious about this intuition that as a scientist it would be irresponsible for me to frame my data in certain ways, because I feel like there's not really any way to present scientific data that doesn't come with a frame inherent to it.
Right.
So I mean, even if I just give numbers in a table, the way that I present that data is, it's just naturally going to lead people to reason about it in a certain way.
That's right. It's literally
And
a
so, I mean, if I'm a scientist and I say, well, gosh, I really don't want to frame my data, it almost seems like I'm just denying the fact that I'm going to do it no matter what, and that I need to take into account how I present my data when I do so.
Yeah, so I think I think perhaps I missed the word deliberately there a lot. I wanted to put deliberately framed, and I think that's a distinction that scientists would make, even if they recognize, yeah, we're framing in some sense, right? You know, like the Tversky Kahneman, you just described it in terms of saving lives, right? It's not like you're intentionally trying to get one thing or the other, right? It's just that you said it and it evoked something. I think the issue is with the intentionally part, right? The deliberately framing means thinking about what effect is this going to have on the values that are elicited in your audience, and that's the part where I think they're reluctant to sort of be thinking about, right? Because then I have a choice. I can choose to do this, which would elicit this set of values, or I can choose to do that, which would elicit this other set of values, and I don't want to make that choice, right? Because then I'm doing something that's not in my area of expertise. So it's sort of, yes, I don't think they're mostly, it's not like they engage in all this, but I think the idea is basically, well, even if you tell me I'm framing, okay, but I wasn't deliberately trying to change the values that were part of the discussion, right? Yeah, it happened, but.
I guess I want to argue with the scientists who've answered your survey more than I want to argue with you, but they're not,
Right.
So I work in medicine, and it's going to make a difference if I present the results of my trial that 92% of people who tried this therapy, it was effective, versus if I say 8%
Right.
of people who tried this therapy, it was
Right.
not effective. And so that's always going to be in the background.
Absolutely.
And if I'm not deliberately thinking about that, then it almost seems like I'm being irresponsible
Right.
in a particular way.
Right. Now, I think there's a bit of a, right, I think there's that ideal that numbers are neutral somehow, right? Just leads people to, yeah, even when we know that, the numbers are neutral part is, well, they're the numbers, and, I think that's the overlay. I think that's sort of uppermost in people's mind.
So I guess this story goes for both of you, but I was initially interested with these two figures. So I keep hearing about we need more activist scientists or something like that. Or is this being implied by saying, well, we should talk about science and activism and having publicly engaged scientists, things like that. And sort of tacit behind that, I'm sort of assuming is this idea that it is a full stop a good thing to have more scientists being activists. And then I actually think about Pauling, and I don't think about the two Nobel Prizes. I think about him and the tattoos on the forehead.
Yeah.
Yeah. He suggested that first with sickle cell anemia, then he expanded for other recessive genetic diseases that if you tested positive or you find out you were heterozygote for one of these diseases, you should get that mark tattooed on your forehead so that if you meet another person who has it, you'll know not to.
Fall in love.
Yeah. And he
reproduce.
yeah, and so he would recommend like one you could be on. I think he said maybe you could be on like their genitals, and he's like, well, maybe I was kidding, anyways. But he kept saying, like, well, maybe I'm really not. And so I see that aspect of the citizen scientist too.
Yeah.
And so I think it was like, well, was it good for scientists to pursue their values and try to incorporate into society? We only want scientists to be activists and as much as we want anybody else to want to be activists. Like, well, it depends what you're pushing for. There's no inherent good about being an activist. It's sort of my initial reaction, but maybe that's not fair. Maybe we need like a democratic activist thing or something, like we need more, and so they'll balance each other out or something. I don't know. What's your takeaway from that kind of aspect of these people?
Well,
Or Laughlin, I mean, he was a great activist.
yeah, yeah.
Not nice.
You know, so one thing that I think of is if you're talking about today, that it doesn't need to just be scientists who are activists about science. It can be science studies scholars, and we can provide our own kinds of. We can bring our expertise to the table to help make sense of, because there are very technocratic people like Pauling who are who very much like, he thought science could be used as a tool to develop policies, to approach politics. I mean, just very black and white on some things. And I think that there's a role, there's a place for other people, not just scientists, to be activists about scientific topics. And actually, Pauling and Dunn were on a court case together about detonating a bomb in one of the atolls, and the other people on it were mothers and people who lived on that island, and they were trying to get kind of a whole mix of people. Like that there are more people who are concerned about these things than just the scientists. But I also, something that I think about too is this, when you look at the science communication literature, there's all this talk about public understanding of science. Now we're moving into a public engagement of science and technology. So, the scientists, now the idea is that you need to start interacting with citizens in a much different way. No more of this deficit model, dumbing down of the information, the way the public understanding of science or how scientists used to do. But there should be these, you bring people to the table and you have these consensus groups and you talk about issues, and so people start learning more about science and technology. And I don't really know what to do with some of that stuff, but I find that, but that's sort of what I think about too when you're saying, you need to engage. Well, there's this push that really came out of the UK of going towards a public engaged science and technology test and going away from public understanding of science. So I don't know if some of that, what you're hearing, is coming out of that's sort of a hot thing, right?
Yeah,
that's to replace something else.
It's an
But
either, I guess.
yeah, you know what? There's going to be people who do both, and people are going to do it. So I guess it's more of a trying to understand what they're doing and helping them understand what they're doing. I know I'm not going to agree with what all the activists say, but.
Oh yeah. There's kind of this assumption that the more science activists we have, the better. It's it really depends.
Yeah.
On the content of the activism,
That's
which seems like a no-brainer, but it's not like we're discussing what are they being activists about? It's relevant.
Right, and for me, the way I would say it is, there are all kinds of moral issues in there, right? And absolutely, so there's going to be ethical advocacy and there's going to be unethical advocacy, and it's sort of going to depend on what you're advocating for, and sort of, not only whether or not I think respecting autonomy is one kind of thing, right? Sort of let people use it, but there are going to be other considerations there too, right? So yeah, I don't think it's just a full stop.
I was curious, sort of building on what you were making, Danielle. I'm really interested in drawing comparisons between the biomedical case in terms of providing information and the broader case of scientists providing information. Sometimes when I've drawn comparisons in some of my work, some of the responses that people made is that, well, in the medical case, it works a lot better because you can focus in a little bit better on the values of the particular patients you're working with, and so then these framing choices work a lot better because you can in some ways think about, okay, given this particular audience, where are they coming from, what are their concerns, what are their values, blah, 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 blah. And people have pointed out, and sort of, to me, they'll say, well, it's way messier. Obviously, it's way messier, but they'll say maybe there are such differences that you can't draw good comparisons when scientists are speaking to the general public, because then you have, people with very different kinds of values. And so, it would be nice, I kind of like the idea that maybe there are cases where you could frame in a way that's going to sort of help everybody's autonomy. Maybe there are just such widespread misconceptions, or you can sort of frame information in a way that alleviates some potential misconceptions or helps some people out and doesn't, harm anybody else's autonomy. That would be the really nice picture. But the worry is that maybe that's not always going to work out. And so, anyway, so that's just one comment that I think you raised a really good point. It's kind of interesting to look at the differences between the medical case and other cases. And the other thing I was just curious about was, I think that there's this appealing picture. I guess that it's the idea of framing information in order to advance people's autonomy. It seems a lot simpler and like it's going to work a lot better if the scientists can be confident that they actually have the truth, and that then they're going to sort of help people understand this truth in accordance with meeting their values. And I wonder if some of the scientists' sort of worries is the thought that, well, if we may think that we have it right, but we're wrong, we would do less harm by giving sort of more bare data, whereas if we're more confident that our interpretation is right, and then we frame it in such a way to kind of get people on board with it, then we end up, causing harm. So I don't know if that's totally coherent, but it's just, a couple things that come to mind. I'm really sympathetic overall to what you're saying, but I was just trying to think from the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're coherent to the second part first. You raised examples, and I'm totally blanking on his name now. It's just similar kind of examples. What he just said about
Jonathan.
thank you, about policy, engaging with policymakers. He said, well, the guy's going to make a vote tomorrow anyway. It's going to get used, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think your conditions under which it would do more harm than good if you leave it open, right? The information, if you're, I think probably if you're in a situation where you have the luxury of having more time to study, and then maybe you should refrain from that part, right? But if it's actually relevant now and important, then I think that's a condition for which maybe you should do it.
And actually, I guess you just made me think of, Parker noted that in his own work, sometimes he'll say, well, you could look at it this way or this way or this way. Maybe sometimes that's a way of cutting the Gordian knot, and saying maybe you don't have to give just one kind of interpretation.
Right, so you can do it multiple different ways. And I think the other thing to say about that is you are not, a scientist is seldom talking to the public, right? I mean, yes, maybe if you're one-on-one, it's a little more obvious, but you are often speaking to particular interest groups or whatever, and in that case it may be a little more obvious what their interests are. And then I do think the scientist has to then do a little bit more thinking about what's actually in their best interest, not to put things on there, but because so many other factors can be overriding, something else can be preventing them from actually accomplishing what they need, right? It's actually, yes, and there are ethical concerns here about sort of how much you read in and how much you figure that out. But if in fact, you're pretty sure what the person's trying to get to is X, doing this other stuff, and it's not gonna get there, then give him or her another frame that will, let her get around that, right? Time.
Oh,
All right.